All right, let's get right into it. We're cracking open a recently declassified file on a massive strategic failure called Operation Epic Fury. And look, this isn't just another war story. This is really about that dangerous gap between political ambition and what's actually possible on the battlefield. It's a cautionary tale of how a plan for a quick, clean victory spiraled into a total regional catastrophe. So, get this. It all started with a decision that was made in just 22 minutes. But that single decision, it sparked a 6-week crisis that got 13 U.S. service members killed, caused over 1,700 casualties in Lebanon, choked off about a fifth of the world's oil supply, and sent prices through the roof. The big question we have to ask is, how on earth did a surgical strike that was supposed to deliver a quick regime change go so completely off the rails? To figure that out, we have to go back to the very beginning. You see, before all the chaos, there was a promise, a really seductive one, actually, sold to the White House, the promise of a quick, clean, and totally decisive victory. And on paper, you can kind of see why they bought it. It looks deceptively simple. The Israeli blueprint laid out a 4-pronged attack designed for nothing less than total regime collapse. Step 1, decapitation. Take out Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Step 2, dismantlement. Just destroy Iran's missile programs. Step 3, uprising. Stir up some internal riots. And finally, a ground front, using Kurdish fighters to stretch Iranian forces then. The ultimate goal? To install a new, secular leader and basically remake Iran in just a few weeks. Now, what was fueling all this optimism? Well, analysts now call it the Maduro effect. See, there was this recent successful raid that captured the Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro with very few casualties, and it created this powerful illusion in the White House, a false sense of invincibility. They started to believe that this kind of neat, surgical regime change could be just, copied and pasted anywhere, completely underestimating how resilient a place like Iran might be. And this was the line that sealed the deal. The argument that doing nothing was actually more dangerous than doing something. This powerful bit of framing completely shifted the debate. Suddenly, a preemptive strike wasn't just one option on the table. It was framed as an absolute necessity. But, behind the scenes, not everyone was buying it. Not by a long shot. Deep inside the U.S. administration, there was a ton of skepticism, a growing conflict over a plan that a lot of senior officials felt was just completely unmoored from the facts on the ground. U.S. intelligence basically took a red pen and drew a line right through the middle of that Israeli blueprint. They said, look, the military objectives, killing the supreme leader, blowing up missile sites, yeah, those are achievable. And why not? Those are technical problems you can solve with a bomb. But the political goals, sparking a popular uprising, achieving real regime change, those were flagged as completely detached from reality. And that was the fundamental flaw right there. They confused technical precision with the much harder challenge of engineering an entire society. CIA Director John Ratcliffe didn't pull any punches. He straight up called the scenarios about a popular uprising and a new secular government farcical. Now, that isn't just cautious doubt. That's a screaming red flag from the head of your intelligence community telling you the entire political premise of your operation is basically a fantasy. And if you think that was blunt, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was even more direct. When he was shown the plan for regime change, his response, according to the declassified docs, was simple. In other words, it's bullshit. That just perfectly captures the raw, unfiltered skepticism that was happening at the very highest levels of government. So this debate completely fractured the administration. On one side, you had the pro-intervention hawks, people like Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who were pushing for immediate action. And on the other, you had the anti-intervention skeptics, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, who were warning about regional chaos, backlash at home, and just totally unpredictable retaliation. It was this classic showdown between the desire to land a decisive blow and the very practical fear of getting sucked into a long, costly war. All of this internal fighting was building towards one fateful decision. And with the administration so divided, diplomacy became a tool not for peace, but for getting ready for war. Yeah, analysts have a great name for it now, pantomime diplomacy. While all the negotiators were sitting down for talks in Geneva, the U.S. was secretly carrying out the biggest military buildup in the region in a generation. The talks were just a strategic mask, a way to buy time to move massive assets like the USS Gerald R. Ford into position while Israel got its defenses ready. And then the clock started ticking. The CIA got this incredible piece of intelligence. Ayatollah Khamenei and his entire senior leadership team were planning a rare meeting in daylight at a compound in central Tehran. It was the perfect, but very fleeting, target window. The pressure was on, and the final decision came down while the president was on Air Force One, just 22 minutes before the military's deadline expired. The order was given. Operation Epic Fury is approved. No aborts. Good luck. And just like that, the plan was a go. But that clean, surgical operation they'd promised in the war room, it quickly devolved into a messy, escalating, and frankly brutal reality on the ground. To be fair, the opening strike itself was a stunning tactical success. The daylight bombing was incredibly precise. It hit its targets in Tehran and killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and his top commanders. So from a purely military technical point of view, the kinetic part of the plan actually worked perfectly. But this is exactly where that gap between a tactical win and a strategic failure becomes so painfully clear. The expectation was that by killing the leadership, the regime would just shatter. But the reality? The deep state infrastructure, the institutional DNA of the Islamic Republic, it just absorbed the blow. The system didn't collapse, it pivoted. The late leader's son, Mujtaba Khamenei, who's a really powerful figure with deep ties to the Revolutionary Guard, he immediately took control. They had killed the man, but they hadn't killed the system. And the retaliation was swift and it was widespread. Completely contrary to all those optimistic predictions, Iran's counterattack was massive. They hit U.S. installations all across the region, including an operations center in Kuwait, killing 13 U.S. service members. The war immediately spilled over into Gulf states that were historically neutral, and the whole region was plunged into crisis. Iran immediately played its trump card, its geography. It heavily militarized the Strait of Hormuz, that critical choke point for about a fifth of the world's oil. And this wasn't just a blockade. They were threatening to set ablaze any ship that wasn't authorized. The economic shockwave was instant. Crude oil shot past $100 a barrel, and nations in Asia were forced to start rationing fuel. The exact scenario the skeptics had warned about was happening in real time. And the chaos didn't stop there. The conflict triggered a devastating second front. Iran's main proxy, Hezbollah, launched retaliatory strikes on Israel. That, in turn, drew a massive Israeli bombardment of Beirut and southern Lebanon that killed over 1,700 people and brought the entire region to the absolute brink of a much, much wider war. So, at the end of the day, what was the final price for this massive strategic miscalculation? Well, the fallout was immense. It shook alliances, it rocked economies, and it rattled the very foundation of U.S. foreign policy. Politically, this unilateral action was a complete disaster. It kicked off huge protests at home, with 69% of Americans demanding that Congress authorize the action. On the world stage, the UN and the EU condemned the move, and it created a major split within NATO, with key allies just refusing to support the operation. And this really gives you the final balance sheet. On one side of the scale, you have the tactical wins. Sure, they assassinated the supreme leader. But on the other side, you have the crushing weight of the strategic costs. Depleted U.S. munitions, destabilized global markets, a fractured NATO, and most importantly, an Iranian regime that actually survived, was probably hardened by the experience and just dug in deeper. The promise was a surgical strike. The reality was a long, devastating regional war with no clear way out. You know, the war didn't end with a victory parade. It ended with a fragile ceasefire and a total deadlock. The core demands from both sides still completely unresolved. The violence was paused, sure, but the U.S. was left entrenched in a crisis it had started, having spent an immense amount of blood and treasure only to end up with a new Khamenei in charge anyway. Which leaves us with one last big question. This entire operation was based on a specific idea of what victory looked like. But when political ambition clashes so violently with military reality, and when a tactical win leads directly to a strategic catastrophe, how do you even begin to measure the true cost of that victory?